and welcome everyone to this very first Pan-Baltic Infrastructure Summit. We have a very exciting agenda ahead, and this is also a very, very fantastic venue, so welcome to all. So just before getting on stage here, I received a very fair question, which was, what a non-profit such as the World Economic Forum is doing in this space. So first, let me put your mind at ease by telling you more how the World Economic Forum fits with it, infrastructure. So we are not just about our flagship event in Davos that many of you might be familiar with, but basically during the year we work on a lot of different challenges and issues, and of course infrastructure is part of that. And it has been an institutional initiative at the Forum for the past 7 years, and we have been involved in development of different partnerships and collaboration agreements. We help to create different financing models at the global level, but we also have some work at the national level, and this is where I get involved. And we also have a specific focus on the enabling environment and how to accelerate project delivery, such as the asset recycling model, for example. But for the rest of my talk this morning, because I'm sure you find the World Economic Forum interesting, but not that interesting, I would like to do two major things. So one is to quickly recap the landscape, get us all on a common footing for the rest of the day, and then I would like to spend the majority of my talk by sharing some viewpoints we hear from our stakeholders all around the world, basically the challenges they are facing, and I'll also try to illustrate them with a few examples so it's a bit entertaining for you as well. So let me start by putting this into some context. So infrastructure is a big deal, and we all know the numbers. Something like $4 trillion US dollars need to go into infrastructure, and this obviously includes a $1 trillion infra gap or financing gap. So these are very big numbers, and if you look at the current sources of funding, you have you understand that the gap needs to be bridged urgently in order to have infrastructure the way it should be, and also to have it across the developed and developing economies. So now, if you look at the headwinds in that space, you immediately see where the problems are. So basically, the main capital equity and equity owners are pension funds and insurance companies. They have something like an estimated capital pool of 60 trillion. And it seemed that they shifted to define their contributions with a bias towards more liquid assets, which infrastructure is traditionally not one. And the insurance companies with the capital requirements of Basel II and Solvency II, Basel III and Solvency II, obviously. And the same basically applies for the banks and the debt space. So you can clearly see the headwinds in this space, and there is a need for some creativity on the solutions. And it gets even worse when you look into the emerging markets, and of course the majority of financiers there are governments, and their fiscal positions are probably not going to look better in the future. So when you see that 2/3 of the infrastructure gap basically sits in the emerging markets, you understand better the role that are playing multilateral agencies such as we saw earlier this morning, AIB or EBRD, MIGA, and others. But beyond all of this, there is also a big supply and demand mismatch, and we did a quite extensive work in this area by basically mapping the ecosystem of investors against the government supply. And even though private equity and sovereign wealth funds attract a lot of attention these days, the pools of capital are actually much lower. And what you see particularly in greenfield equity is that governments would like the funding to go there, but investors are not quite ready to provide the funding at the scale that is needed. And in brownfield, which is naturally more appealing for investors because of the risk profile, there is very often lack of capacity from the government side. So you have got this mismatch going on this space. And in addition to what we have seen, it's also a very fragmented ecosystem and quite underdeveloped in some areas, given how long infrastructure has been around as an asset class. So of course, some of this is being addressed, and I would like to mention the fact that to date, there hasn't been a consensus actually on the benchmark for infrastructure. So we all know it's somehow linked to inflation, we all know it's somehow linked to government yields, but there actually isn't an index that I can go and look at if I'm a pension fund willing to invest in infrastructure. So that said, there is also some good news in the area, such as the macroeconomic conditions that remain overall positive. And we also observe some useful initiatives and platforms such as the G20 and Hamburg principles that are willing to attract more private capital into infrastructure. So that basically concludes my remarks on the landscape, and now I'm going into some major views that we hear around the world from the different stakeholders, and I will start with the first one, which is obviously a very important one: long-term vision and planning. So I'm a government and I have a certain number of greenfield projects to build, and on the other hand I have pension funds and insurance companies with long-term liabilities that basically prefer predictable cash flows which must match with my infrastructure investments. So they should basically invest in my infrastructure projects, right? And obviously it doesn't work that well. So when we looked at this, we realized that it comes down to a quite simplistic view, where you have on one hand policymakers and public sector that have public welfare on mind, and they will look at the projects from a public welfare perspective, and this is what they are elected for. But we also observe a serious perception gaps between investors and governments, not only in their expectations for the private investments, but also in the understanding of investors' mandates and needs. So what we find here is a massive disconnect in vocabulary, and we actually think that you can do a lot of good simply by aligning this vocabulary. And we looked at policymakers because this is where we think the biggest need is, where the fragmentation is, and we basically said you should have, and this is something that most countries don't have today, firstly provide investors with strategic vision across all your infrastructure projects. Don't fragment it out into various agencies, various procurement processes. Tell investors what your long-term vision is. Then, of course, give them the right enablers. But as per the last point, give them the value proposition and have a conversation up front about how returns and public welfare will balance in the future. What are the risk and return sharing mechanisms? Because without this conversation upfront, you will actually never attract the right investors. So that's one point on how to bridge the gap. As the next point, I have picked impact investing, and this is a less traditional view on infrastructure. But at the same time, it offers some interesting ideas in the conversation between policymakers and investors. So bear with me just for a slide. In rural India, where obviously electricity distribution is limited, people use paraffin lamps to light up their homes. And when you burn paraffin in your home, it's not a good news for your health. The light quality is bad, and you also generate other health-related issues that basically then translate into economic development, and this is where the stakeholder angle comes in. Now, the traditional look at this is, let's fix the immediate problem, let's make better lamps. And so let's develop an LED solar-driven lamp, and that's great. But the trouble is that it's very hard to sell a high-tech lamp to rural Indians that have very limited purchasing power. So you're trapped in this small paradigm where basically you cannot attract the right amount of funds, and every single solution will stay isolated. So here is how we look at it from an impact investing and infrastructure angle. What about if we develop an off-grid solar power and we combine it with the telecom infrastructure? So basically the lamps become just a side benefit of all that. And all of a sudden what you do is that you create this economic ecosystem that will allow prosperity, growth, on the basis of electricity, of course, but it will also bringing some of the communication infrastructure, and this will allow farmers to phone ahead for crop prices on the market, etc. And at this level, you may also get the governments more interested. You get the utilities interested. And you can also do capital structures that are actually much bigger than just one grant. And I would like to point out this particular item because you can basically do capital structures where foundations or other agencies come in and say, rather than writing a grant on a small scale, I'm providing a first loss guarantee to an infrastructure bond. So it does two things. One, of course, it increases financing for infrastructure. And second, for the foundation, assuming that the default probability is something like 20%, the balance sheet of the foundation now goes 5 times longer if they just write a simple grant. And so the foundation can do much more with the same money, and they'll have much greater impact. So by thinking in ecosystems, in this positive feedback loops, infrastructure can actually provide a lot of social benefits, and then policymakers will understand it also as a joint role to play. Now, one point I would like to get your attention to is political and regulatory risk, which is something we hear about a lot, and it's a big issue obviously when your assets have such a long lifespan, and private investors often see discrepancies and contradictions when working with the public sector. And often policymakers actually agree with this statement, and I would like to show you a short video where you will see the former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown commenting on this issue.
Make the investment case in the long run.
Let me ask you, Gordon Brown, just as the minister does not feel like representing all of Africa, I am officially not here to represent the United States, but I will tell you that in the United States, politicians are absolutely 100% the problem in moving forward on infrastructure. 100%, in fact, might be 120%, although I don't think that's mathematically sound. In the world, all of what we're talking here is about good planning, technological expertise. The third runway at Heathrow, I mean, it's an airport I avoid now, because that third runway, they've been talking about it for, I had hair when they started talking about it.
We actually decided to build it, and then it was cancelled. and that's one of the problems. You have changes of governments, you have changes of policy, you have people wanting to change the regulatory rules, and then you have, of course, administrative inefficiencies. And certainly you do have political calculations. I mean, someone said that a politician was someone who promised to build a bridge even when there was no river. And there is some truth in the idea that these are prestigious projects that people announce and then don't bother to do the work to make them actually happen.
So on that one, we actually find that it's useful to look at both regulators and policymakers are trying to do, and generally they're just people trying to do their jobs, and this job consists of two angles. One is guarantee the systemic stability, and especially after 2008. And the second bit is basically to ensure fairness in the process by ways of competition and others. So a lot of the volatility we actually observe in the regulatory space, once you think of it, comes from good intentions along those two aspects, but they actually ultimately don't connect with business reality. And again, a lot of this is about sharing risk and rewards the right way. And we often find stakeholders come to neutral platforms such as ours, or actually this forum is fantastic for that too, to sound out views and best practices and basically understand how to better navigate through the political landscape, which is very often country-specific. And this basically brings me to my next point, which is infrastructure in the infrastructure space. No, competitiveness in the infrastructure space. This is to see if you are following. So in the current context of globalization, investors are obviously global shoppers. They consider investment opportunities worldwide. And therefore countries are competitive with each other. And based on our last competitiveness report that has been released just 2 days ago, so hopefully I got the numbers right, Singapore, Switzerland, and the US are the third most competitive economies in the world. And in comparison, you can see that Lithuania is number 41, Estonia number 29, and Latvia number 54. So, in addition to that, there is also competition at the national level as well. And of course, historically, infrastructure has been traditionally driven by countries, but with increased urbanization, sometimes looking at the country level is no longer enough. And there are, for example, provinces in Africa where these provinces get better ratings than the overlying country. And what will make a difference is actually, again, back to my point earlier, long-term planning, fair risk allocation, and obviously a solid pipeline of bankable projects. So my next and last view is about public-private partnerships in the developed markets. So the situation in developed markets reminds me the panda-bear paradox. So those of you that know about panda bears, everyone likes panda bears, but they're endangered species. And you know, panda bears presumably like each other, but they struggle a bit with procreation. And lots of efforts are being done in this area to address it. And everyone knows that developed markets infrastructure is a great asset to invest in. And Europe in particular has great needs to develop infrastructure, and yet it's like the panda bears, not enough is happening. So part of that is that infrastructure always looks fit for purpose until it's too late, and particularly in developed countries. Take, for example, Germany. So the Germans feel pretty good about themselves. Their roads look good, they have nice hospitals, houses are great, but you know, 10 years from now, it might not be that good anymore. And you really see some of the signals already, but there is just not enough pressure, public pressure, to really make the investment needed. So creating that awareness and creating that burning platform is actually quite important in developed markets. So these were my 5 views from what we hear around the world, and I will conclude with a couple of additional points, and if nothing else, these are the 2 points I would like to leave with the audience. So first, we all heard earlier about building bridges to nowhere, and I would like to reiterate my earlier statement. In many ways, it makes sense to look at infrastructure from an economic ecosystem perspective. How does it fit into a larger framework? How to avoid fragmentation that creates higher risk? And second, infrastructure requires a good understanding of the other party's needs. And very often, it also requires a significant build-up in the public sector expertise and skills. And it was last October in one of our Indonesia working group meetings where we were discussing how the private sector can help the public agencies in Indonesia to bridge this knowledge gap, that one of our working group members said, learning how to do PPPs is only by doing PPPs. So to end with, I would like to emphasize that infrastructure is a great potential that can deliver a lot of benefits, but what will actually make it succeed is more systemic thinking and increased public-private cooperation. With this, thank you for your attention, and I hope you'll enjoy the rest of your program here, and looking forward to continue this conversation.